Hi everyone, welcome to my individual paper presentation at the CATR 2020 conference Partition Ensemble, entitled Around the World in 24 Motions, Decoding Milča Mayerová's Atopical Body in the dance book Abeceda. My name is Anna Paliy. I'm a doctoral candidate in the third year of my PhD at the University of Toronto in the Center for Drama, Theatre and Performance Studies. Just a quick note to say that if you'd like to contact me after the presentation, please feel free to email me with any questions or comments at anna.pally@mail.utoronto.ca. That's anna.pally@mail.utoronto.ca. All right, let's begin. After great catastrophes, in some sense, one always starts over from the alphabet. František Šaldadeclared, 1928. The artistic atmosphere in interwar Prague was nuanced as much by the city's need for remoralization after the devastating effects of World War I and the ensuing flu pandemic, as by the steady optimism rooted in its faithful ties to tradition. As it evolved throughout the 1920s into a gathering hub, cradling intellectual circles, both local and from abroad, Prague became an inviting site for myriad crossroads and philosophical cross-pollination and collaborative creative enterprises. Amid this cultural upswing, inspired by the Russian formalists of the collective Apayaz and the Moscow linguistic circle, both born out of the Bolshevik Revolution, avant-gardists Vítězslav Nezval and Karel Teige joined resources from 1923 onward to work together on curating their own revival of poetic language characterized by the union of unlikely ideas and objects. As members of the Devětsilcirclegathered group and the founders of its poetism program, their common goal was to pose questions to their contemporaries about the function of grammar in everyday life, and consequentially about its large-scale impact on social environments. To this end, they circulated experiments using combinations of media such as photography and poetry, which served to envision the potentialities of what Teige called a purely abstract form of communication, sincere, evocative, and free of the weight of ideological symbolism. In one such experiment, entitled Abeceda of 1926, Nezval and Teige synthesized their skills to produce a satirical, tongue-in-cheek analysis of how shared meaning comes about in society, from the early stages of childhood literacy development, by mimicking the genre of the alphabet letter primer to remobilize its usage for an adult audience. They invited the Rudolf Laban-trained professional dancer and fellow Czech avant-gardist Milča Mayerováco to participate in the project as its choreographer and subject. Her skilled athleticism and rich movement vocabulary would prove compelling, indeed instrumental, in staging the novelty of a performing body in the midst of sheer idiosyncratic meaning-making, guided by the nursery rhyme anecdote. While the pedagogical technique of placing the Latin alphabet alongside the human silhouette to show children how sounds are shaped long preceded the poetists, the clever and ironic use of the primer's formal elements, specifically in the globalizing avant-garde context with an emphasis on dance and on adult spectatorship, has focalized Nezval and Teige as innovators since its publication. With Nezval's poetry at the forefront, it inspired immediate and widespread critical appraisal by the likes of Russian linguist Roman Jakobson, who credited it as a unified front to keep the word from being treated like a fetish during the period of cultural uncertainty and heavy political censorship. Commentary regarding the merit of Abeceda as a photographic and poetic achievement for the public good and a benchmark for progressive text-image experimentation by surrealists is far-reaching. And yet, Mayerová's first-hand center-stage role within the collaboration has been peculiarly underestimated, largely perceived as an act of mere posing. Though she helped engineer it, she is seldom listed among the book's authors, beside her two counterparts, and rather often referred to as their model, arguably because her contribution to the work is seen as a passive or confusing one, which exists beyond the boundaries of general intelligibility. her pantomime too vague and her physique too esoteric for a reader to understand, both lacking symbolic clarity, and thus dismissed as decorative. In fact, all three authors' stylistic choices, taken in conjunction, show us quite the opposite. That it is precisely within Mayerová's visceral presence between the book's pages that its radical potential is brought to completion and its social message solidified. To help demystify the lingering misconception orbiting Abeceda's legacy, which infers that it conceptualizes the body and thus the dancer as necessarily symbolic and therefore irrelevant in communicating pure language, I argue that Mayerová's raw act of lending her physique to the passage of Nezval's poetic meaning, which is only later compositionally animated by Teige's graphics, is the deciding criterion which gives the book its critical power and achieves its intended abstraction. The book's layout, joining in rhythmic patterns, bold font letters, thick typographic shapes, and snapshots of sweeping bodily gestures against a receding backdrop of mainly blank space, responds to the formalist maxim that grammar is not linear but cosmic. It reveals how language is constructed as a relational system of moving parts in a vast and expanding network where fragments can interconnect and recombine to create infinite new meanings molded by context, and not merely as a list of already coherent, unchangeable units objectively pointing to things in the world. In Nezval, Teige, and Mayerová's combined imagination, this tenet of formalism is not only championed but also surpassed, in that they do more than use the textual, the visual, and the kinetic to mutually support each other aesthetically. Granted, they take turns in asserting and mirroring each other's styles with an interplay of word, image, and physicality. All while doing this, however, they also manage to subvert each other's stability, undermining the seriousness of each chosen medium by mutually imitating its outlines, but ensuring they are ever so slightly off-center and out of focus. In other words, uncanny. By simultaneously caricaturing each other, the three authors effectively strike a dialectical tone embedded deep within the book's subtext, ebbing and flowing between the lines. The series of 24 quatrains, each corresponding to a letter of the Latin alphabet and situated against a constructivist photomontage framing Mayerová's silhouette in various energetic positions, invites its reader to explore a simple narrative, harkening back to the comfort and familiarity of a young child's language learning manual. Yet, in the same stroke, it also uproots dependency upon the symbolic beacons a reader would expect to find in such a book, like A is for apple, by replacing them with surprising, at times jarring imagery. In this, the title Abeceda reveals its irony. Its testimony is not on behalf of the obvious communicative power of grammar, but rather on behalf of the immediate need to find new, better ways of communicating because of grammar's demonstrable limitations. By manipulating the line of the poem, the flat plane of the photograph, and the 3D flexibility of the human body to bring out their formalities, and thus make the alphabet strange again, invoking Shklovsky's Ostranение, later Brecht's Viefet. The authors make the inevitable failure of prescriptive and symbolic language, like that so casually epitomized in conventional children's books, suddenly conspicuous. As its writer, Nezval denies Abeceda the easy format of a definitive beginning and definitive ending, rejecting closure and instead choosing to sustain a progression of layered tensions and illusions between words, sentences, and stanzas, which bring no resolution. What is more, in his preface to the album, he explains that his verse serves only as, quote, a motif, a stone that stirred the water's surface, a pretext for a poem, end quote. Calling his contribution theme-free and associative, he challenges the reader to inject meaning into the poetry. Why does he step back in such a way? Matthew Witkowski proposes a psychological rationale in his analysis of the book, explaining that, quote, for those like Nezval who had come of age during the carnage of World War I, nothing less than new worlds would do, end quote. guided as they were by the impetus to begin afresh the project of a totally new planet. Nezval, just as Teige and Mayerová, operates in a living environment where masses of people can be seen, quote, fleeing for the new world, where in trains and automobiles time speeds up and space dilates, and where in the city rush noon flows immediately into dusk, end quote. Their Prague is that of crowds of bewildering sizes, of accelerating physical momentum, and of fluttering intellectual networks. It's a constellation of collisions, both ethical and aesthetical, which to no surprise imbues its artists with rapidly changing observations about how humans connect and make their truths known to each other in a society where nothing remains shocking. This translates in Nezval's refusal to comply with an ideological approach to art and in his resignation of the absolute authorial voice. In Abeceda, the expressionistic landscape of Prague's outer climate is contained and given shape as, at best, as gymnastics of the mind in the poet's words, suggesting the need for constant movement and expanding flexibility. With this vibrant turn of phrase, Nezval notably, even if very briefly, soldiers the body-mind binary in preparing his audience for the reading of Abeceda, as if to say that the intellect found therein can only be fully realized by Mayerová, whose embodied image is loaded with unfiltered creative momentum, because it encodes a communicative flow just as it deconstructs the debate about where pure human connection resides, in the psyche or in the flesh. The answer, of course, is both. Abeceda ticks with an impulse to restore the collective imagination of a rattled society at all cost with exuberance, playfulness, and nonchalance. Its contents conjure the details of a world committed to laughter, even though there are tears in its eyes, quote unquote, a world invested in moving forward through crisis toward the new and the unknown. To achieve its goal, the book endeavors the seemingly impossible literary task of creating itself over and over again as it unfolds in live time. Each moment it's witnessed by a reader. In this light, it can be viewed as a theatrical rather than a literary work, staging an immersive, quote, alien experience of time and place, unquote, in lieu of that of common reality, and thus rendering the image of a possible future unbound both temporally and spatially, that is, a utopia. In philosophy, this kind of alternate yet very tangible reality is articulated by the Platonic definition of the word chora, developed in Timaeus. The chora, characterized by Plato as the literal outskirts of a city, marking the political periphery, through which people pass on their way to and from the polis, but where people never stay, and as such where strange, controversial, and even magical events can unfold, has been revisited by literary theorists such as Julia Kristeva and Jacques Derrida, more recently to designate the slippery, womb-like metaphorical spaces where linguistic meaning is allowed to pass freely and creatively outside of the constraints of symbolism. Abeceda may be experienced as such one metaphorical space, a site for passing through and for seeing the world from an itinerant point of view. Alluding to both Derrida and Kristeva, Thomas Rickard describes the chora succinctly as a, quote, architectural component of our informational scaffolding, functioning as an exterior co-repository for thoughts and actions or activities we customarily locate as beginning exclusively within our minds. With its unclear beginning and unresolved ending, Abeceda achieves the choric objective, in that it exteriorizes a matrix of multiple possible versions of speaking, of looking, and of moving. It nudges its reader to adapt to ways of expression and embodiment which may usually seem fringe to them, and creates an external memory of these possibilities as the book is opened and its contents discovered. In yet another ironic twist, the book thus regains the pedagogical value of the very original format it parodies. Rickard clarifies that the chora, quote, transforms our senses of beginning, creation, and invention by placing them concretely within material environments, informational spaces, and affective or bodily registers, unquote. In short, it serves to invent and reinvent worlds, to reevaluate origins, and to build futures by a repeated deferral of established meanings. Within the material environment of the printed album, this deferral is achieved by the three authors' intentional displacement of familiar alphabetic prompts and their corresponding images. As the authors deliberately compromise the book's readability, the reader is compelled to carry on, to progress, to, quote, move from static ideas to vital activity, end quote, working to radically reconfigure their understanding of rhetorical space. In Abeceda's neat display of the Latin alphabet, it becomes ominously evident that the letters do not precisely match up with their respective symbols or anecdotes, all intermingling across lines and pages like clusters rather than sequences, and that the resulting effect is a fluctuating feeling of straying off course, of missing the point of the story, and of getting lost in the margins. Teige, in his own photographic context, sees art as, quote, a single, chaotic, and cinematic supercity, end quote, where the local and the cosmic converge. Within Abeceda, he builds upon Nezval's poems to casually, and yet sublimely, juxtapose the fragments of such a poetic metropolis of the future within the confines of the traditional book form. The architectural inspiration behind this visual polysemy is evident in areas of the photomontage where he purposely emphasizes Mayerová's physicality, using shapes which act as towers or platforms, at times evocative of citadels, as in the letters H and M, and at other times recalling bridges, as in the letters N or U. It is important to note that these shapes act as buttresses to support the body without making it look vulnerable or tiny. While the textures of Mayerová's image infer fleshiness, she takes control over her motions in a way which appears explicitly strong. Paradoxically, the timing of her movements as captured by Teige's camera lens are both precise and murky, both exuberantly moving and morbidly still against the splintered backdrop. Mayerová thus crystallizes the book's intention to create mimetic confusion by foregrounding herself as the personification of the Cora, toward which Nezval's rhyme and Teige's collage only refer. Across the pages, Mayerová maintains a distance and an autonomy over her own image, authoring herself with the use of Teige's camera lens as a poetic subject, not, quote, through letters and poetic language, but precisely in relation to them, end quote, thus evading the display of her dancing body as a sensuous object, even as she is literally framed by the sensuality of poetry. As such, Mayerová situates herself within Abeceda as a participant actively involved in the process of invention. Several layouts in the book are particularly illustrative of the ways Mayerová weaves streams of meaning together by playing with and reforming sounds and shapes into moving targets, quote, always bumping up against a limit or boundary they must exceed, end quote. To take a first example, as seen on page 15 in the depiction of the letter B, she is postured in a loose approximation of the double curve carved by Teige's graphic shape. In contrast to the spliced and stacked circle in the typographical image which forms two mathematically identical demi-moons parallel to a perfect rectangle. The dancer's left arm and left leg are curved only to the point of the human limits posed by the anatomy of her bone joints, looking vaguely folded rather than circular. In their analog attempt to be a bee, they fail, mocked by Teige's smooth cutout. Her stance in turn is not exactly vertical but slightly tilted to the left, enhanced by the repose of the head and by the placement of her center of gravity on the right foot only, idly contradicting the rectangle overhead. The resulting shape roughly resembles that of an oval or an almond rather than that of the letter B. What's more, the fold generated by the left arm is significantly more bent and smaller than that generated by the same leg, creating visual imbalance vis-a-vis the two moons, and achieving the choratic confusion mentioned earlier because it evokes the rhythm of the number 8, say, more than it does the capital letter B. Mayerová's right arm, meanwhile, is inadvertently curved too, even in its somewhat strained attempt to merge with the torso, as evidenced by the downward tension in the hand against the thigh. Echoing subtly its bent counterpart on the other side. All around, the inescapable stiffness of the dancer's form is exposed here, as the choreographic ideal dissolves to give place to a refusal of precise representation. Inhabited in the atopical body, a body which can escape every circumstance but that of its own corporeality, the bee destabilizes symbolic meaning but replaces it with a generative semiotic potential, offering alternate interpretive pathways. Alongside the image to the left, the reader encounters Nezval's quatrain, which reads in part, quote, "B, second letter of a children's primer, an image of a lover's breast," end quote. While the two moons juxtaposed by Teige comply in echoing the verbal imagery of a bosom, Mayerová refutes the explicit relation of her body to this text outright in her fully frontal pose, which not only denies the reader the visual curve of her own chest, but also shatters the symbol altogether by centering the sharp angle of her elbow and knee using shadow and contrast. Next, on Abeceda's pages 40 and 41, the letter O introduces a basic, universally known shape in the circle, presumably simple to draw, describe, and emulate. No longer a bosom, the circular shape now symbolizes cosmological abstraction, inferred in the adjacent verse by words such as, quote, "ellipsis in an infinite zone, eternity, and the unknown," end quote. Teige effectively glues the two demi-moons of the bee back together here and re-implements them here as a single coherent form, displayed graphically on page 41. Still here, too, does Mayerová step in to disorient the symbol by deliberately foregrounding her almost comically angled legs as her upper body recedes horizontally off stage to the left and toward the background, as if pulled by some magnetic force out of the picture frame. The zigzag position in which she places her legs, appearing ready to lift off or to buckle, bears nothing of a pictorial resemblance to the letter O. The laterally bowed torso extending from this contorted shape produces visual chaos to override any effort at graphic organization by Teige. Further yet, the blocked-out black flooring and wall forming a backward L alongside the dancer emphasize a lurking reminder of an omnipresent exteriority. An angular otherworld to that of the circle, that is, the whole globe as laid out in the atlas, a wholly human invention. As this intrusive shape evokes a different letter of the alphabet featured on another, separate page, it defers the reader's attention from the O, summoning attention to other non-linear methods of reading the text, and by metaphorical association, the globe. As such, it acts as a mnemonic tool playing with familiar connections, nudging the reader toward other letters and poses located elsewhere, such as, for instance, the neighboring pages 34 and 35, where the L resides in its very own verse, alluding in turn to the letter T of page 48 and 49. The elusive nature of this page in relation to its others, combined with Nezval's poetic description of the stargazer figure observing post-Einsteinian time-space unfolding, binds the pages of the book in a playful, choose-your-own-adventure structure to engage back-and-forth exploration instead of the typical by-the-book reading of the alphabet. Finally, the letter X, represented on pages 56 and 57 of the album, depicts a conceptually similar, albeit geometrically opposite disorientation of form as that of the O. The memory of the circle recedes to give way to this last set of jagged alphabetical prompts, X followed by Y and Z. Mayerová, to produce the X, uses all four of her limbs to shape not one but two diagonal cross formations, one with her forearms and one with the lower half of her legs. This begs the question, which X is the one corresponding directly to the letter concept, and which is its echo? After all, the posture has no single focal point on which the eye can rest easily, as Mayerová obstructs the view of her own face yet again, allowing her torso to curve into the background. Both the bottom and the top X shapes, in their distracting asymmetry, compete for primary and final attention as Nezval's verse reverberates didactically, quote, X at the beginning, X at the end, end quote. Semiotically, the poem reassures that there is no primacy or finality inherent in the X shape itself. It points to all four of its diagonals with equal force. Narratively, however, the verse is misleading. The X was not present even elusively at the beginning of Abeceda, nor does it mark its end, if we must ascribe an end to the book at all. That is, both the letters Y and Z remain, imbued with their own valuable relations and references, awaiting to take their manifold effect. In quite a stark contrast, as Mayerová presents herself on the first and last pages depicting the letter A and the letter Z, respectively, she disengages completely with the X by opening up her posture, exposing her neck, and using the placement of her arms to literally frame as opposed to isolate her body. If indeed the X usually leads to the beginning and to the end, as symbolized in a treasure map, now both the beginning and the end lead back toward the X, in all of their inviting openness. All this considered as a vehicle for the choric, atopical body free from conventional notions of time and space, the layout of the X manages to accumulate the strongest effect among all letters, if not by the way it accents Mayerová's physical amplitude, then by sheer number. There are 9 cross shapes referring to the letter displayed on pages 56 and 57. Together they form, as echoed by the adventurous stargazer inhabiting Nezval's verse, a constellation of pathways emanating centripetally outward to guide the itinerant reader toward the pages which precede and follow them. In her process of performing self-reinvention, Mayerová plays unapologetically with binaries and assumptions regarding her body's ability to connect with the mind of her reader. She, quote, gives rise to a discourse and withdraws from that discourse all in one and the same motion, reorienting the gaze in new and winding directions from one moment to the next. In true choric manner, she stages an ongoing process of expanding and retracting, of stretching and arresting, of concealing and exposing her moving body to interrogate its communicative capacity alongside spoken language. According to Witkowski, within Mayerová's corporeality resides a most radical revitalization of linguistic form, coming closest to actualizing poetism even relative to her two discerning collaborators in Nezval and Teige. The resulting body language she invents, positions to act as a site of deferral, of Derridian difference, single-handedly, quote, disrupts the book utopian character, because rather than projecting a holistic system, it accommodates competing incomplete meanings, end quote. Amid the philosophical pursuit of poetism to set a tabula rasa for a new creative vocabulary to evolve in an exceedingly globalizing world, Mayerová, in her own right, produces a unique contribution by implicating the body as an intrinsic component in the exploration of the value of language. By moving with grammar, alongside grammar, and despite grammar, she illustrates that embodiment does not borrow from the alphabetical paradigm to convey meaning, but that it already inherently contains the alphabet within it, and more. It's the alphabet, rather, which borrows meaning from its ever-evolving human source, the body always in transit and always in progress. Thank you for listening.